Alyssa Klink reports.
Reporter Alyssa Klink.
Cronkite News reporter Alyssa Klink.
Alyssa Klink reports from our Washington bureau.
He stopped in his tracks to say a prayer for the sister cathedral in France, but Coconino County Supervisor Jim Park didn't need any convincing. They said they are overjoyed to see the amount of support going to Notre Dame during this time. The military careers of the nation's top naval officers begin. On a warm, sunny day in Washington, visitors pause to listen as the funerary bell rings at the Washington National Cathedral. The bourdon bell rang for 7 minutes, joining cathedrals around the globe to remember the tragic fire Tuesday at Notre Dame in Paris.
It's the most terrifying thing to any of us who love and serve cathedrals, because we're called to be stewards of the place.
When Dean of the National Cathedral, Randy Hollerith, heard about the fire at Notre Dame, he stopped in his tracks to say a prayer for the sister cathedral in France.
Matter of fact, Notre Dame is depicted in one of the stained glass windows of this cathedral.
Both are Gothic cathedrals, but there are differences. Washington National Cathedral is 111 years old, what Hollerith calls a toddler next to 850-year-old Notre Dame. And Facilities Director Jim Shepard said the Washington Cathedral is made mostly of steel, stone, and concrete. With catwalks as the biggest wooden element, there's little room for fire hazards.
And probably the only similarity there is that our outside roof is lined with lead, similar to Notre Dame.
Despite that, officials here had already started a 3-part fire and safety plan when the tragedy in Paris occurred, a review process that Shepard says will continue.
Anytime you have a sister cathedral like this that has a problem that is as catastrophic as they had, you always look at it and try and figure out what you can learn from it and how you can improve your structure.
Some safety measures, like emergency lighting, sprinklers, and smoke detectors, were already in place, but Shepard expects more, if only because safety codes have changed drastically since the groundbreaking here in 1907. Most of the damage at Notre Dame came because of its oak wood roof and spire. Shepard said the spire itself weighed 700 tons, puncturing the vaulted ceilings, but he said fire brings other problems.
The fire caused a lot of damage, but so will the smoke and so will the water that was put in there to mitigate the fire.
And fire is not the only threat. The Washington National Cathedral was rocked 8 years ago by an earthquake that caused $34 million worth of damages. The cathedral has raised and spent $15 million on earthquake repairs in a process that is expected to take years. $1 billion have already been pledged to rebuilding Notre Dame. While the Washington National Cathedral is still trying to repair from earthquake damages back in 2011, they said they are overjoyed to see the amount of support going to Notre Dame during this time. At the National Cathedral, I'm Alyssa Klink, Cronkite News. The words might have been familiar to any Catholic churchgoer.
For the sake of his sorrowful passion.
But the setting was definitely not a typical church. This was the Marriott Marquis in downtown Washington, where 1,400 people turned out to pray and hear speakers at the 15th Annual National Catholic Prayer Breakfast. One of the main speakers was Phoenix Bishop Thomas Olmsted, who was giving a speech on a hotel stage, but could just as easily have been giving a sermon in a church pulpit.
Christ has been summoning me to lift up the truth proclaimed by the Second Vatican Council that abortion is an unspeakable crime.
Abortion was one of the main topics here, where the fight over Roe v. Wade still rages more than 40 years later. Speakers like Abby Johnson, a former Planned Parenthood clinic director who is now a high-profile anti-abortion activist, urged the crowd to keep fighting.
Be proud of your faith, be bold of your faith, and let's continue to work until abortion is unthinkable.
Olmsted also decried the state of modern-day marriage, saying it is not treated with the respect it merits, reiterating points he made last year in a 66-page pastoral letter.
It's a difficult time for married couples to faithfully live out their vocation, which is so badly needed today.
Speakers got a sympathetic ear from acting White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney, who praised President Donald Trump for allowing freedom of religion to flourish, especially for Catholics.
If you take a look at what the administration has done in the first 2.5 years, I think you can see the principles of our faith being manifest.
Olmsted made a point of steering clear of politics, but said it's encouraging to see public officials practicing their faith out in the open.
A lot of these are elected officials or others who are leaders in government or in commerce or different ways in society. and yet their Catholic faith is important to them too, and that's very important for us.
In Washington, Alyssa Klink, Cronkite News. For Duffy's Irish Pub co-owner Casey Callister, it was not surprising that people would be in his bar at 10 a.m. on a weekday watching a congressional hearing.
We're prepared for this. This is what we do.
Prepared for a crowd that filled every seat with their hands glued to a drink and eyes glued to the TV, all to watch the testimony of President Trump's former attorney, Michael Cohen.
I think they say it was a great game watch experience.
Callister said that since a lot of his customers work on Capitol Hill, what happens today could affect their jobs.
Well, I think in D.C., when there's a big event like this, it actually impacts people's lives. You know, there's somebody that's jobs might be affected by what they say today.
What they saw was a grilling of Cohen by Republicans. They harped on his guilty pleas last year to 8 counts of campaign finance violations, bank fraud, and tax fraud. Cohen faces 3 years in federal prison, but while the hearing was serious, that didn't stop occasional bursts of laughter and surprise from the barflies.
As a pub, we've always been a place to come and debate and have a pint and talk over your differences.
But if there was debate today, it was muted from the crowd. Some in business attire, some in tees and jeans. Callister said it's the perfect place for house watchers, and he expected the bar to stay busy for the rest of the day.
We have a pretty good crowd. The pub's full. That's great at 10 a.m.
Well, people across the country were glued to the congressional testimony today of Michael Cohen. Arizona is already one of the most pro-life states in the country. Supporters say the Dream and Promise Act could give a pathway to citizenship to as many as 2.5 million immigrants currently living in this country. Today's debate over the Green New Deal came as the Senate was holding its first test vote on the bill. But fruits and vegetables are not the biggest culprits in the rise of food recalls. When asked today if he would sign a bill without wall funding, President Trump would only say he wants to look at it first. But with the deal almost in hand, today was a day for joking, not fighting.